Hi, my name is Igor Kwiatkowski and I'm a game designer here at Wargamer Game Studio. Today we're going to learn how to play our new board game Anno Domini 1666. This video will mostly focus on the rules of the game, so if you want to learn about its story and its theme, please check out our Kickstarter video. Today we're going to play the introductory scenario Murder in the Tavern. Here we will have the French, the Musketeers D'Artagnan, Porthos, supported by two generic King's Musketeers, play against the Poles, led by Wołodyjowski, also including Skrzetuski, Longinus, and two Dragoons. The objective of the bands will be that D'Artagnan is in the possession of a letter and he will try to escape the game board, and the Poles will try to stop him. Please note this is a prototype of the game, so the final components may be different, and also the rules are also subject to change. If the printed rulebook says one thing and this video says something else, then the printed rulebook is right. As you can see, we have the game already set up with characters along with the starting equipment placed near the game board. We have our miniatures on the board set up according to the scenario rules, and we have two player decks that the players will use throughout the game. To begin the game, each player draws 3 cards each from their deck, from their respective deck. Obviously, the cards are not known to opponents. I'm going to show them to you just so that you can see what they look like, but for the duration of this video, we will keep them covered. Normally, at the beginning of a turn, we also have the initiative phase, where players play these cards to determine who goes first. But in this scenario, it is determined that the red player goes first. There's nothing else to do. Let's go right to the action. In the action phase, players take turn alternating activations of their characters. So, for example, as we said, the red goes first. So he says, I'd like to activate Longinus and rush into the action. We activate Longinus and he decides to do the full movement activation. It grants him 4 movement points to spend, for example, like this. For 1 movement point, I can open the door. This is called a movement action. We will get to it a bit later. So this was 1 movement point, 2, 3, and 4. Now Longinus is activated. We rotate the card to keep track of who's been already activated and who hasn't. And now, since he's adjacent to an enemy character, they are both considered engaged. Now note that in Anno Domini 1666, combat does not take place in the action phase. Combat has its whole separate combat phase, so we'll get to that. For now, they are considered engaged, which means they cannot move away from each other, and presumably they will fight soon enough. Now, as we said, players take turn activating their characters. So the blue, the French player, activates one of his characters. So the French player will want to activate his King's Musketeer to shoot at the Dragoon, but what he will try to do is to take 2 partial actions instead of 1 full action, because what Longinus did was take the full movement action. All he did during his action was movement, and the King's Musketeer will want to shoot and then move up to the Dragoon. First, he declares the quick shot action. To resolve the shot, we need to take a look at the firing weapon, which is the musket. It has the difficulty level of the shot of 6. Now, we look at the firing character's card. He has the musket skill of 1. He needs to draw blindly from the deck a card of at least 6, but he gets +1 for his skill, but then he gets a -1 for this being a quick shot action. Not an aimed shot, it's a quick shot. So the modifiers offset, so he still needs a 6. Let's see what he gets. He gets a 5, which is not enough. Fortunately, what you can do, if in your hand you have cards that match either the original card's suit or value, you can reinforce the test with such a card. I have a matching 5 card. When you reinforce with a card that matches the value, you get +2 to the total. But there is this funny rule here. If you make an unopposed test, this test is unopposed because you're not competing against your opponent directly. You're trying to match the difficulty level. So in an unopposed test, you can only reinforce up to the difficulty level. You cannot go over it. So the total is not 7, it is 6. And let's see how much the damage was done. The basic damage would be by how much you beat the difficulty level. You matched it, so it is 0, but the musket has 4 damage on the location of the hit. How do I know this? Well, because the original card was hearts. Hearts means it is a shot to the body, and the musket has 4 extra damage on shots to the body. So the basic damage of 0 plus the musket's damage of 4 means we put 4 wounds on the dragoon. Firing a gunpowder weapon makes a lot of noise, which can attract the guards. When the guards come, the game is over and we determine the winner. So, whenever you fire a gunpowder weapon, whenever a character dies, and at the end of each turn, you discard 1 alarm counter. There were 12 of those according to the scenario rules. There is one more effect of this shot. Because the dragoon received 4 wounds, this matches his crippled threshold. He's not dead yet, but he's seriously wounded, which we called crippled. This means he has -1 to all his skills and abilities, and also there is a chance that he will run in the morale phase. He will just give up. The last thing you need to remember about when firing a gunpowder weapon is to place a reloading counter on the weapon. Gunpowder weapons of these times took a really long time to reload, so you can't fire them every turn. Usually you can't even fire them every 2 turns. They just take a long time to reload, so you need to keep track of that. After resolving the quick shot, the King's Musketeer still can perform one more partial action. He will want to perform the partial movement, like Longinus performed the full movement for 4 movement points. He only moved during his turn. Now the King's Musketeer will want to spend half of his activation on movement. So he declares the partial movement, he receives 2 movement points to spend, and he just wants to spend 1 to move 1 space. Now they are engaged with the dragoon across the window in a kind of similar manner like Longinus and the other King's Musketeer are engaged. To finish off his activation, we need to remember to rotate his card. The red player will want to help his poor dragoon, who is now both crippled and engaged by the enemy. So we activate the other dragoon. He will declare the full movement action, much like Longinus before him. So he receives 4 movement points. We go 1, 2, and 3. Now, why did I move across this King's Musketeer's zone of control? I said that if 2 characters engage each other, they cannot move away from each other. Well, there is this rule that if King's Musketeer is already engaged by another character, you can ignore his zone of control for the purpose of movement. So I could move from here to here legally. He only spent 3 movement points, but this is enough. He doesn't want to do anything else, so we just mark him as activated by rotating his character card. The blue player would like to activate Porthos to move closer to engage Longinus and help the incoming combat. What he will want to do is to activate Porthos, declare the full movement action, because he will only want to move, and he receives 4 movement points. Now he would like to climb to the table, which means he needs to climb an elevated boundary, which is a movement action. Now a movement action was also, for example, opening the door at the beginning of the game, but opening the door was very easy. You just spend 1 movement point, you do it, you're good. To climb the elevated space, you need to spend 2 movement points to even attempt it, and then you need to pass a difficulty level 4 agility check. Now, agility test will work mostly like the shooting test before. You have your difficulty level of 4, you add your skill, in this case agility. Porthos has agility of 0. He just needs to draw blindly from the deck 4 or more. Let's see what he gets. Alright, he got a 2, which means he failed, which means his 2 movement points are wasted, but other than that, he can try again. He spends 2 more movement points to try again. So again, no modifiers, he has agility of 0. Alright, he got the 4. He can climb across the elevated space onto the table. His activation is over. And all 3 of those guys are now engaged. The red player has 3 more characters to activate. So what about the poor dragoon, who is crippled and engaged by the enemy? He could move away, as we said before, because these 2 guys already engage each other. He could move away if he wanted, but he's going for the risky play. He's going to stay in place and support the incoming combat, because even though he's crippled, he will still add to the combat. So we can just activate him without performing any actions. He just stays in place, doesn't do anything. The blue player still has unactivated D'Artagnan and unactivated second King's Musketeer. The second King's Musketeer may not move for 2 reasons. Because you might think that, hey, just right now I said that if Longinus is already activated by Porthos, then this guy should be able to move. Well, no, there are 2 reasons for that. First, Longinus has a very strong special rule called the living barricade. It means his zone of control may not be ignored even if he's engaged by other enemy characters, so you cannot disengage him easily. The other reason is that this King's Musketeer is basically stuck. You cannot make diagonal movements if your agility is 0 and the Musketeer's agility is 0. You may not push through a friendly character who's on the table. So the poor Musketeer has to just activate, do nothing, and await the combat phase. The red player has 2 more characters to move. Let's go with Skrzetuski. These guys just want to join in the action as soon as possible, so they will declare the full movement action. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Skrzetuski is now activated. Now we have one more interesting situation with the blue player's activation. Normally he would need to activate now, but we have a special rule that if you have fewer characters on the board than your enemy, you retain the right to the last activation. So you can keep passing the opportunity to act until your guy is the last to act. Because the blue player has fewer characters, he says, I want to pass with D'Artagnan and see what Wołodyjowski does. So Wołodyjowski has to act, he cannot pass, but he will perform the full movement too. He will go 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, what you've seen here, see, 1, 2, 3, and 4, I skipped a corner. I did a diagonal move. Normally, most characters cannot do this, but Wołodyjowski has the agility of 1. So during his action phase, he can make 1 diagonal movement. Remember, the Musketeer couldn't do it, and Wołodyjowski can do it. Let's mark Wołodyjowski activated. There is just 1 more character to be activated this turn. It's D'Artagnan. He just wants to move up and support the incoming combat, so he declares the full movement activation. He receives 4 movement points. He goes 1, 2, 3. He doesn't want to go the 4th point. See, because he has an agility of 2, he could make 2 diagonal moves. Let's mark him as activated, and the action phase of the first turn is done. We are now ready to start the combat phase. To start the combat phase, we need to rotate all of our character cards back upright, because during the combat phase, as you will see, characters will also activate kind of like in the action phase. What I mean by this, that each character on the board that is engaged by an enemy, each of these guys will need to be activated by the end of the combat turn. The initiative goes the same as in the action phase. So if in the action phase the red went first, now the red goes first again. Now red has an interesting choice to make, because his best ways to go are to either attack this King's Musketeer with the Dragoon to kind of save his crippled Dragoon. This is the defensive play, so to say. Also, he can go on the offense by activating Longinus and trying to kill or hurt the weaker King's Musketeer. Let's play conservatively. We will activate the Dragoon and attack the King's Musketeer. Now, what happens is a combat test. It's the most common type of an opposed test. This time you're not trying to beat an abstract difficulty level. This time you just need to score more than your opponent. Each player can decide whether he plays a card from his hand. For example, he has a strong card and really wants to win the combat, or he can let fate decide and play from the deck. To this card you have modifiers. Again, you have the relevant weapon skill, you have the superiority of your weapon. In this scenario, all the weapons have the same superiority, so we're not going to have to worry about it. Also, there are modifiers for support of friendly characters, and perhaps some others that are kind of outside of the scope of this short introductory scenario. Let us have the look at the Dragoon and the Musketeer who's gonna be fighting. They each have the weapon skill that is suitable for their weapon of 1. Also, they each have support of 1 friendly character. Because see, if you imagine that these two guys are fighting, then the Musketeer is supported by D'Artagnan and the Dragoon is supported by the other Dragoon. So they both receive +2 to their cards. Now, let's say that both players really want to win this and they decide to play their cards from their hands. So, you play this card. Obviously, I know what I'm playing, but normally you don't know what your opponent is up to, and you pick your cards and then you reveal them simultaneously for some surprise. Now, as you can see, the red player played 8, the blue player played 5. They both get +2 modifiers, so it's a 10 to 7, which is a difference of 3. This difference is the basic damage of the attack. And then you see, just like with the shooting, you see where did you hit your enemy. So you take the soldier sword, because the Dragoon was armed with a soldier sword. The extra damage from the soldier sword is 2, because when the winning card was cup, and the soldier sword has +2 extra damage on cup, which means a hit to the hands. So a total of 5 damage means that the King's Musketeer is in a lot of trouble. But remember that we can reinforce our tests, also the combat tests. So the blue player can reinforce the test with another 5 from his hand. And as you may remember, if you match the value of the card, you get +2. So the difference between the combat total is not 3, it's just 1. Because he got an extra 2. And with the extra damage from the sword, the damage is just 3, which is much more manageable. It does not make the Musketeer crippled. Let us put 3 damage on the King's Musketeer, who lost the combat. We discard all the cards played. Now, note that when you need to discard an 8 or a joker, remember to discard it rotated 90 degrees, because whenever you get 4 discarded 8s and joker cards, you reshuffle your deck. We will get to this later. Now, after losing the combat, the losing character usually needs to retreat, which is basically moving 1 space away outside enemy zones of control. This will not happen this time, because this Musketeer is still engaged by the Dragoon, who has not been activated yet in this combat phase. So there is no retreat after combat. What happens, however, is that we activate both participating characters. So obviously we activate the Dragoon, who initiated the attack, but also we activate the King's Musketeer. See, so this is why this was the defensive play, because now this activated King's Musketeer, it's this guy, he will not be able to initiate combat against this Dragoon who's already crippled. This is why this was a good defensive play. Alright, these two guys are activated. Now the blue player needs to activate a character. He will want to do more or less the same thing in that he will want to attack with Porthos against Longinus, because after Longinus is activated, after the combat, he won't be able to pick on the poor and weak King's Musketeer. Let's take a look at their modifiers. Porthos has the relevant weapon skill of 3. Longinus has his weapon skill of just 2. And this time only Porthos gets support, because even though the Musketeer is weak, he still adds +1 to Porthos' total. So Porthos gets 3 + 1, it's a +4, and Longinus just gets +2. Let's assume that both players want to play cards from their decks. If you don't have cards in your hand or you don't like them because they're very weak, you can always play from your deck. So let's say that the red player drew a 4 and the blue player drew a 6. Now remember the modifiers. Red player got just +2 for his skill for a total of 6, and the blue player has 6 + 3 for the combat skill +1 for the support for a total of 10. So the difference is 4. Now Longinus is in trouble, but fortunately he has the fencing skill of 1, which granted him 1 parry token. He can use it by flipping it, and he says, well, I'll try to parry your strike. Perhaps you won't be able to hit me after all. The difference was 4, and parrying is a bit like an unopposed test. If the difference was 4, you add 1 for a total of 5, and he needs to draw from the deck 5 or better. Alright, he parried easily. Remember to discard 8 cards horizontally. The hit was parried as it never happened. You discard these cards, and what happens now is a riposte. Riposte is basically striking again. It's a new round of combat. For this round of combat, both players need to play cards. Even if you played from the deck, you could play from your hand. If you played from your hand originally, you can play from your deck. It's a completely new round of combat, so to say. But still, let's say that the players want to play from their decks. So Longinus gets a 5. Porthos gets a 4. Now remember the modifiers. Porthos had 4 total, 3 for the skill, 1 for the support, so he's got an 8 total. And Longinus had +2 for his skill, for a total of 7. So the difference is 1, and remember to add the damage of the weapon. We need to determine the hit location. We take a look at the winning card, even though it was lower, it's still winning after the modifiers. It's the horseshoe. So this suggests a hit to the legs. Well, no, we have another fun rule. If you fight from over an elevated border from a higher place with an opponent in a lower place, then you cannot hit him in the legs. Your bonus is that all such hits are changed into hits to the head, which usually gets you much better damage. So let's have a look at the rapier. See? If this was a hit to the legs, it would be just +1 damage. As a hit to the head, as it is now, it's +2. So you're ahead. Let's place 3 wound markers on Longinus. Again, Longinus is not going to retreat because he is still engaged by an enemy character who has not been yet activated. So we just activate Longinus, and we activate Porthos because they've already fought. Let's take a look at the red player's situation. Wołodyjowski and Skrzetuski will not activate in this combat phase because they are not engaged. Longinus has just been activated. This dragoon has been already activated in the first combat. We have the crippled dragoon left. Now he doesn't really want to fight because he is crippled. He gets -1 on all his skills. So if he loses, he's likely to lose, and if he loses, he's likely to die. So what can he do? You can declare the defensive stance. It means that you activate for the combat phase, but you do not initiate any combat. And because this musketeer has already been activated, he's safe for this turn. The blue player has one more character to activate in this combat phase. This is D'Artagnan. D'Artagnan will want to fight the adjacent dragoon. See, the dragoon can still be target of the attack. He has already been activated, so he cannot attack, he cannot initiate the combat himself, but he still can defend. D'Artagnan is a very interesting character because, well, he has a rapier of 3, which means he's a good fighter, but he also has a very cool skill called Frenzied Attack, and it means when he is on the attack, which means that it's his activation, he's the one initiating the combat, he gets +1 to the combat total, but only if he draws or plays a red card. D'Artagnan's combat modifiers will be +3 for his skill, possibly +1 for Frenzied Attack, but he will not receive the support. This King's Musketeer will not support the combat because he is engaged by the dragoon. He is not able to help with the other dragoon. What about the dragoon's modifiers? Well, he just has the sword skill of 1, no support. So let's draw the cards. Let's assume that the players draw from their decks again. Well, it's not like blue has any choice. All right. We got a 3 horseshoe, which is a red card, which will trigger the Frenzied Attack. And we got a red heart. D'Artagnan's total is 3, plus 3 for his rapier skill, and +1 for his Frenzied Attack that triggered, because he is on the attack and the card is red. He has a total of 7. The dragoon has a total of 4, but he can reinforce. See, he has in his hand, he has a card that matches the suit. It doesn't match the value, so if it matches the value, it would add +2 to the total. Because it just matches the suit, it adds +1. So we had 7 combat total for D'Artagnan. We have 3, 4, and 5 for the sword skill for the dragoon. The difference is 2. As usual, we need to see where did the hit go. It's the horseshoe, so it's the legs. The rapier has +1 for hits to the legs. The total wounds for the dragoon is 3. Let's put 3 wounds on the dragoon. And now, finally, we get retreat after combat, because D'Artagnan has just been activated. This King's Musketeer has been activated before. This dragoon needs to retreat. A retreat is basically a move of 1 space, it may be diagonal, that needs to end outside enemy zones of control. So you need to end not being adjacent to any enemies. So the only legal space is here. So their combat is over. We need to activate D'Artagnan. Now red doesn't have any engaged unactivated characters. Well, these guys will not activate, as we said before, because they are not engaged. Blue has an unactivated King's Musketeer, but he doesn't want to fight Longinus because his sword can deal massive damage, so he will just activate by declaring defensive stance. Remember, like this guy. If you don't want to fight a stronger enemy, you can declare defensive stance. Obviously, if the enemy hasn't been activated before, he can still attack you, but you're never forced to attack yourself. Alright, this concludes the combat phase. Now what comes is the morale phase. In the morale phase, if you have common characters, Common characters are dragoons, king's musketeers, and Porthos, Longinus, and name characters are heroes. So, if you have a common character who's been crippled, you need to check his morale to see if he doesn't flee from combat. This is a difficulty level 5 fortitude test. On the morale check, you will usually receive -1 for being crippled, well, because you usually only take morale checks if you're crippled. This is an unopposed test, so you must draw from the deck. You can reinforce from the hand, but you cannot play from the hand. Let's see what we get. Alright, it's an 8, so it's easily passed even with all the negative modifiers. Remember to keep your 8s rotated 90 degrees. We do not have any more crippled common characters, so the morale phase is over. What comes now is the talking phase. Talking phase is a kind of a special phase when characters with special skills like seduction or bribery or such can use their abilities. In this simple scenario, we don't have any of those, so we just skip the talking phase and the turn 1 is over. Remember that whenever we end a turn, we need to discard 1 alarm counter. We are closer to ending the game. We are now ready to start turn 2. At the beginning of each turn, we rotate all our character cards back upright because they're not activated anymore. Also, if you used any parry tokens, you get to flip them back over to their unused side. Well, actually, if you have more than 1 parry token, then if you're still engaged, you refresh 1. If you are not engaged anymore, you refresh all of them. Another thing that you do at the beginning of your turn is, if the scenario calls for it, you place extra miniatures on the table. This scenario does not have any extra miniatures. So we are ready to draw some new cards, because at the beginning of each turn, each player draws 2 extra cards. Right? So the red gets a 3 and a 6. The blue had no cards, so these are going to be his only cards for the turn, which are pretty strong. That's a good hand. After we drew our cards, we need to determine the initiative. Remember, at the beginning of the first turn, it was determined by the scenario. We did not play for it. Now, determining the initiative is kind of like an opposed test, kind of like combat. It means that each player needs to play a card. This card can be played either from the hand or from the deck. It can even be reinforced if you really want the initiative bad. But let's just say that this time the players want to determine the initiative by drawing from their decks. The red player draws an 8. This is a 4th 8. This is going to be interesting in a while. And the blue player draws a 3. Let's say that neither player wants to reinforce this test, this initiative test. Let's get back to the red deck. See, there are 4 8s. Jokers, if there were any jokers played, would be included in this total. So if you have 4 8s and or jokers in your discard pile, you gather all your cards. You need to take note how many cards in your hand you had. We had 3. We gather them all up and we shuffle them. After this, you will draw as many cards as you had before the reshuffle. After reshuffling your cards, you draw as many as you had before the reshuffle. So the red player had 3, he draws 3 new ones. Again, pretty reasonably good hand. And we're good to go. We go back to the action phase with the red player having the initiative, remember, because he got the 8 that triggered the reshuffle. He wants to take the chance and activate the dragoon to shoot and hopefully finish off the king's musketeer. The dragoon will only want to shoot in this activation, so he will take the aimed shot. He's not going to suffer the -1 penalty for taking the quick shot. He is, however, going to suffer a -1 penalty because he is shooting at a target that is already engaged, right? So he's fighting, he's moving around, he's harder to hit, and Actually, as an aside, if his friend was in his line of sight, which he isn't because he's outside of the window, if his friend was in his line of sight, he could be shot, he could be hit by mistake. As I said, he is not in the firing character's line of sight, so the only effect of this character of the target being engaged is -1 on the shot. The half musket, the dragoon's weapon, has the basic difficulty level of 6. This is an unopposed test, so you need to draw from the deck. Alright, we got a 7. This is modified to 6 because of the target being engaged, but still, the 7 was hearts, which means a body shot, and the half musket has the respectable 4 damage on body shots. We take 1, 2, 3, 4 wounds, we put them on the musketeer, and it turns out that the total of 7, he already had 3, the total of 7 is enough to meet his death threshold, which basically means that he's dead. What do we need to do now? We take the miniature off the table. We remove 2 alarm counters. 1 because there was a gunpowder weapon being shot, and 1 more for a character dying. Remember to put a reloading marker on the weapon that just fired, and the dragoon is activated. That's a pretty good shot, if I say so myself. What happens now? The blue player has lost a character, but still the important one, D'Artagnan, is still alive and kicking. He will want to move up closer to the window to possibly escape on a future turn, because remember, the point of the scenario is to escape with the letter. He will want to avoid the dragoon's zone of control. Remember that D'Artagnan has a pretty cool option. He can make a diagonal move because he has a positive agility score. Actually, he has an agility score of 2. So he's going to make a diagonal move and attempt to climb the elevated table at the same time. You may remember that climbing the elevated boundary was a movement action that costs him 2 movement points. He declares the full movement activation. He spends 2 of the 4 to attempt the jump. He is going to have it pretty easy because, as we said, he has an agility of 2. He needs a total of 4, so anything except a black joker is going to be a success. It's an 8 card that is increased to 10. It is 5 more than the target difficulty level. If you beat your difficulty level by 5 or more, it means it's a triumph. And if the skill, ability, action that you were attempting has some special rules attached to it, you might get an extra bonus. Unfortunately, climbing a table does not have any extra triumph rules. So for the 2 movement points, he jumps up on the table. And for 1 more movement points, he jumps off. Now, jumping off is not a movement. It's not a movement action. It doesn't require any extra movement points. It does not require a test. He just moves for 1 movement point. He just spent 3 out of the 4, but he's okay with this. Let's mark him as activated. Now, the red player needs to make something happen. He really wants to get his guys outside the tavern to join the action. Let's activate Skrzetuski. He declares the full movement action. He gets 4 movement points. For the first movement point, he opens the door for 1 movement point, much like Longinus in the first turn. That is 1, 2, and 3. He just spends 3 movement points, and he's activated. Now, the blue player does not have actually any characters he can reasonably activate because his King's Musketeer is stuck much in the same way like the previous turn. Porthos is stuck next to Longinus too. So let's just say we activate the King's Musketeer without doing anything. Now, back to the red player. We still have Wołodyjowski to activate. Let us declare the full movement action. Let's go. 1, 2. And now we're going to attempt to jump through the window. This is a movement action kind of similar to climbing the table. It takes 2 movement points to attempt, but its test is a bit more difficult. It's a difficulty level 5 agility test rather than 4. Wołodyjowski has the agility score of 1, so still he has a reasonably good chance to do it. Unopposed test, I must draw from the deck. Alright, it's a red joker. So red joker has a base value of 10, but on an unopposed test it counts as an automatic triumph. So technically it's an 11, which is enough for a triumph anyway. And this time, jumping through the window has a special rule for triumphs. So normally on a regular success you just move 1 space. And remember, you spent 2 movement points, so this was not very efficient. For 2 movement points, you could only move 1 space. But on a triumph, you may move 1 extra space directly ahead. So Wołodyjowski is kind of 1 space ahead, thanks to the triumph. That's it for his activation. Let's mark him activated. The blue player, again, has fewer modals, so he could pass like in the previous turn, but this doesn't really serve any purpose. So let's just say that Porthos, being stuck in the combat, he just activates without performing any actions. And going back to the red player, the only unactivated character is Longinus, who also is engaged by these 2 guys. He is not able to move, so we just mark him as activated without performing any actions. We have 1 more character on the board who hasn't yet been activated in this activation phase. It's the poor crippled dragoon. He would gladly escape the murderous D'Artagnan, but he can't. They are engaged. D'Artagnan is not engaged by any other characters, so the dragoon can do nothing. Let's just mark him as activated. And this concludes the action phase of turn 2. We need to rotate all our character cards back up before the combat phase. Now for the combat phase, as you may remember, the initiative stays the same as it was in the action phase. So red goes first again. He'll try to take the advantage that he finally has the chance to strike the weaker King's Musketeer with the strong Longinus. Longinus has his weapon skill of 2. The King's Musketeer just has the skill of 1. Porthos does not support this combat because he's already engaged by Skrzytuski. The modifiers for the combat are +2 for Longinus and +1 for the King's Musketeer. And let's say they want to draw their cards from their decks. Longinus draws a 3 for a total of 5. And the King's Musketeer, he draws an 8 for a total of 9. The difference between those is 4, but as you might remember, Longinus can attempt to parry. His parry counter refreshed at the end of the previous turn, so we flip it over to the used side. The difference between the cards was 4. Because the difference between the cards was 4, he now needs to draw a 5. To parry, you need 1 more. Let's see what he gets. He gets a 3, which is not enough, but this, you can reinforce this with a card from your hand. The red player has a 3 in his hand. He adds 3 to the 3. The total is 5, which means the parry was successful. We discard the cards used for the previous combat, and we go ahead to the riposte, which is, as we said, basically another round of combat. Let's say that we want to draw from the decks again. Right, Longinus gets a 5 for a total of 7. The dragoon gets a 4 for a total of 5. The difference is basically 2. This is our basic damage. And then we take a look at Longinus's weapon. The card is the cup, so it means it's a hit to the hands, and Longinus's weapon has +2 damage on hits to the hands. The total damage to the musketeer is 4. Let's take 4 wound counters, and put them on the Musketeer. This is enough for the Musketeer to be crippled, so again, he will need to test morale at the end of the turn, and he has -1 on all future checks. Let us discard the cards used for the combat and rotate both cards as activated. The blue player will want now to activate Porthos and attack Longinus. Porthos, as you might remember, has his weapon skill of 3. Longinus, as before, has the weapon skill of 2. Both of these guys get support of 1 friendly character each, right? Porthos is now fighting, so we take a look at these 2 guys. And Skrzetuski is not engaged by any other enemy characters, so he adds +1. And the King's Musketeer, even though he is crippled and cornered, he still adds +1 to the blue player's combat total. Again, the combat modifiers are for Longinus are 2, for the weapon skill 1 for the support, for a total of 3. And Porthos has 3 for his skill and 1 for the support, for a total of 4. For this combat, let's say that both players decided to play cards from their hands. The blue player decided to play a 7 for Porthos, and the red player decided to play 6 for Longinus. Longinus had 6 plus 3 modifiers for a total of 9, and Porthos has 7 plus modifiers of 4 for a total of 11. Longinus loses by 2. He cannot parry anymore because his parry token has already been activated. The basic damage for the attack is 2. Now we check the hit's location. The cup means the hands. The damage on Porthos's rapier to the hands is 1. The total is 3. But Longinus has an elk hide jacket. This is an armor type item, and it has armor values on some hit locations. As you can see, the elk hide jacket has 1 armor on the hands. The value after the slash is a value used against armor piercing attacks, which are usually gunpowder weapons. This is just a basic attack, so 1 armor works. Longinus only receives 2 damage instead of 3. Let us take 2 damage, 2 wounds, place them on Longinus. Now he has to retreat because this King's Musketeer has already been activated. And again, he has only 1 legal space to retreat to, which is not adjacent to any enemies. It's right here. Remember to rotate Porthos's card to mark him as activated. Let's discard the cards used for the combat. The red player will want to activate Skrzetuski to attack Porthos. This time the modifiers will be kind of simple. Skrzetuski just has his weapon skill of 3. The same as Porthos, as you've seen just a while ago. No other characters support this combat. And let's say that the players decided to play from their decks this time. The red player plays 6 for Skrzetuski, and the blue player plays 7 for Porthos. Both these cards get modified by +3 because both sides had the same modifiers, so we arrived at the 10 to 9 in combat totals. The rapier has 2 extra damage on the body location as dictated by the winning card. This would cause 3 damage. Well, no, again, because Skrzetuski has some serious armor in the way of Hussar Kiris. It has a whopping 4 damage against basic attacks on the body, so the damage is reduced to 0. He still counts as the loser of the combat. He still has to retreat. Well, technically he could parry because he has an unused parry token, but he thinks it's not worth the risk. It's better to lose but not take any damage than risk Porthos hitting somewhere where it hurts. So he takes the loss with dignity and retreats one space. He actually has he has a choice which space he would like to retreat to. He could retreat to any of these 4 spaces because they are not adjacent to any enemies. He will retreat here because it's closest to D'Artagnan, who is the ultimate target of this scenario. Alright, the combat is over. Let's discard the cards. Mark Skrzytuski is activated. The incoming combat is going to presumably be very nice for the blue player because he will attack with a deadly D'Artagnan. He will attack the crippled Dragoon, who is in a world of trouble because he's already crippled and he needs to defend against a stronger character. What are the modifiers? D'Artagnan, as with the previous combat, he has his skill, basic skill of 3 and the fancy frenzied attack skill that might activate and might not. And the Dragoon has his skill of 1, but he's already crippled, so basically the modifiers to his card are going to be 0. Now, because this is such an important combat, both players will want to play from their hands. They both get 8s, but this will not be enough to save the Dragoon. D'Artagnan has 8 plus 3 for a total of 11. The Dragoon has 8 plus 0 because he's crippled, so his skill does not count, for a total of 8. That's an advantage of 3. There is extra damage as usual because of the hit location to the hands as indicated by the cup. To the hands it is 1. The total is 4. We take 4 wounds, put them on the Dragoon, and we see that this is exactly enough to match his death threshold. It means the Dragoon is dead. We remove his miniature from the board. We discard 1 alarm counter because we discard 1 each time someone dies. And we mark D'Artagnan as activated. Alright, we discard the cards used for the combat. Remember to keep your 8s rotated. And we don't have any unactivated engaged characters anymore because Wołodyjowski has not been activated, but he's not engaged, so he doesn't have anyone to fight. So the combat phase is over. Let's go on to the morale phase. Again, we check for crippled common characters because, for example, Longinus is crippled, he got hit pretty bad, but he's not a commoner, he does not take a morale check, he will not retreat. The King's Musketeer hit by Longinus, however, he has 4 wounds on him, which is enough to meet his crippled threshold, will have to take the morale check. The morale check is a difficulty level 5 fortitude test. The King's Musketeer fortitude score is 1, but it will be offset by him being crippled. He will get +1 and -1 modifiers, which will offset. So he needs to draw a 5. Unopposed test, I need to draw from the deck. It's a 2. He fails. The blue player doesn't have any cards in his hand to reinforce this test. So the miniature is counted exactly as dead. He flees from combat or surrenders. We remove him from the game, even though he doesn't have enough wounds to meet his death threshold. He still counts as killed, so we remove 1 more alarm counter. After the morale phase is over, we have the talking phase, which, as we said, is skipped because none of the characters have any skills that would happen in the talking phase. And at the end of the turn, we discard 1 more alarm counter. Alright, I think you have a pretty well idea how to play the game now. We are going to end on a nice cliffhanger because D'Artagnan has a really short way to escape the board. This next turn's initiative phase would be very intense because whoever wins the initiative kind of wins the scenario probably. But you will need to play for yourself to find out. Please keep in mind this is just a prototype of the game, it's not the final copy. and some of the rules are still subject to change. Some skill values can change. So again, if your printed copy arrives and it says something different than this video, please trust your printed rulebook. This video kind of focused on the dry rules stuff, and if you're curious about the game's theme and story, be sure to check out our introductory video. If you like what you see, please be sure to check out our Kickstarter campaign. Thanks for watching. Bye!